Good morning. I'm Jack Berryman, ACSM historian, and we're here today speaking with Jim Barnard as part of ACSM's Distinguished Leaders in Sports Medicine and Exercise Science video series. So thanks, Jim, for talking with us this morning.
My pleasure.
And I just wanted to start off with your very early career, where you grew up, where you went to college as an undergrad, what you majored in, and then graduate school, and let's just work our way through a little bit of your career.
Fine. Well, I was born and raised in Ohio. I attended Kent State University for my undergraduate work, which was in the field of physical education. My goal was to be a coach.
Sounds like a lot of the stories I've heard, Jim.
Yeah. And when I was a senior at Kent, the university hired Larry Golding as a new young professor out of Curitin's lab at Illinois.
Yeah.
And I didn't take any classes from Larry, but I went to a lecture that he gave where he explained he was going to establish this laboratory to test people's performance capacity and do blood samples and really understand a little bit more about some of the physiology behind exercise. Mm-hmm. And it sounded interesting to me, but I wanted to graduate and get out. And
what year was this?
Well, I graduated in 1959.
Okay. And that was the year Golding came?
That was the year Golding came to Kent State.
Okay.
And with a friend of mine, we ventured to California to get a job teaching physical education because this is what I was trained for. And unfortunately, there were no jobs available in physical education.
Huh?
Yeah, we just took off. And what I ended up doing was teaching in the 7th grade in a self-contained classroom. So I taught reading, writing, spelling, math, social studies, and I'm sure that year I learned more than the students did. Mm-hmm. But I learned something very important, and that was I didn't want to spend the rest of my life teaching in the 7th grade. So I decided I would go back to Kent and start in graduate school and find out a little bit more about this exercise physiology field. Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I heard when I got back to Kent for summer school was, don't take Golding for any classes. He's flunking everybody out of graduate school.
He's too tough.
Yeah. But I had already signed up for 2 classes from him through the mail and paid my fees. So I took the classes. Fortunately, I got an A in both of them.
Wow.
And I decided at that point in time I would go back to California for one final teaching year in the 7th grade, and then go back to Kent for a graduate degree and a master's degree.
So you just went there in the summer? And
yeah,
took
I
a
just
couple
went
classes?
for the summer and took 2 classes
Okay,
from him.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So I went back to California and finished my 2nd year of teaching in the 7th grade, and then I went back to Kent full-time graduate studies.
Okay.
And after...
That was 61, 62? What?
59, I taught 60, 61 in the 7th grade, so it was in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I finished my master's degree and decided then I was going to go for a Ph.D. And Larry took me to the FACSM meetings in Atlantic City, and he introduced me to Charlie Tipton, who was at Springfield at that time.
Right.
And I, when I grew up, was very active in the YMCA. So I decided, well, I'll go to Springfield because it's a YMCA college.
Absolutely, yeah.
And when I was introduced to Dr. Tipton, he said, well, he said, I got good news and bad news for you. He said, the good news is, he said, or the bad news is, he said, I'm leaving Springfield.
Okay.
He said, I'm moving to Iowa, and I'm going to establish a new program in the field of exercise physiology. So I decided to go to Iowa for my graduate PhD work.
This is the University of Iowa.
This is the University of Iowa.
Okay.
And I was actually the first student in Tipton's exercise physiology program
Wow.
at the University of Iowa.
And what year was this?
Well, it must have been 1964.
Okay, okay. And then when did Baldwin and all those guys show up? Terjung?
Well, they came in after Merle Foss and I were the first two students in the program.
By the way, I'm going to talk to Merle this afternoon.
Yeah. Oh, good.
I'm pretty excited
Yeah.
about that. Okay, so you and Merle were the first two.
Merle and I were the first two, and then Ken Baldwin came in, and Frank Booth and Ron Terjung were there when I was a student, along with Jack Rowell, who later on moved to physiology and became a very famous muscle physiologist at Ohio State.
Wow, okay. What a group, gee.
There'll probably never be another group like that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So let me just quickly ask you, was TIP and ACSM then? Or did all you
Yes.
guys sort of get involved with ACSM
Well,
at Iowa?
That's an interesting story. I came to Iowa in '64, and in '65, the national meeting was held in Madison.
Okay.
And of course, in those days, the meetings were very small.
One room.
One
basically.
room,
Yeah.
less than 100 people. As a matter of fact, my registration number on my identification card for sports medicine is 724.
Oh my heavens! Wow. And the headquarters of ACSM were in Madison.
We're in
then.
Madison, right.
Yeah.
What happened was Skip Canucken and Charlie Tipton had organized a symposium on lactic acid metabolism. And the two of them were involved in it, along with Phil Golnick, and Larry Rowell was supposed to present some data.
Wow.
And about a month before the meeting, Larry called up Tip and said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any travel money, and if the college doesn't pay for travel money," which they don't for members,
Right.
I can't show. And so Tipton says, "That's fine, just send your slides. I got a graduate student that can present your data." So that was my first introduction to ACSM, presenting before this large group, first big talk I've ever given.
Wow.
And needless to say, I was a bit nervous before the presentation.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in the front row, and Golnick leaned over and grabbed my arm, and he said, calm down, calm down. He said, "You know more biochemistry than probably anyone else in this room."
That was nice.
So that was nice.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
super.
So that
Wow.
was my introduction to sports medicine and ACSM.
Wow. And you've been a member ever since.
Ever since. I've presented at every meeting except maybe 6 or 7 at most.
Mm-hmm.
And I've only missed 3 meetings over that entire period
Oh
of
my
time.
heavens. Wow. Not many people can say that,
That's right.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Back to 65. So Jim, so you finished your Ph.D.
Yes,
at Iowa
at Iowa.
in what year?
68.
Okay. And then what was your next stop?
Well, I wanted to go back to California because I enjoyed the California lifestyle.
After
the 2
Ohio,
years.
right?
Yeah, and Iowa especially.
In Iowa, yeah, of course, yeah.
And I wrote letters to every major and minor school on the West Coast and didn't get any job offers. But I'd written a letter to UCLA, and the head of the department was very nice. He wrote a letter back, and he said, "Gee," he said, "we just hired a new young guy out of Michigan State, Reggie Edgerton. But," he said, "there's a doctor over in the medical school who has become very interested in exercise, and he might offer you a position." And this was James B. Peter.
Mm-hmm. I don't
And,
know him.
well, he's a rheumatologist,
Okay.
MD, PhD. And so I contacted Dr. Peter, and he said, "Well, I'll offer you a postdoctoral fellowship."
Wow.
And this was in the School of Medicine at UCLA. I had no idea what a postdoctoral fellowship was. And who had ever heard of someone with a physical education major going to a medical school for a postdoc?
Yeah.
And I asked him what exactly his laboratory did, and he explained to me, "Well, we isolate muscle biopsies from patients that have muscle diseases, and we study mitochondria and sarcoplasmic reticulum and things like that." And it sounded very exciting to me, and I didn't even ask him how much money I was going to get paid. I said, I'll be there in 2 months.
Wow.
And so I moved back to California to start the postdoc, which I did for 3 years.
Oh, gee. Okay.
And we did some very exciting research during that period of time with Reggie Edgerton and Jim Peter and myself.
So you were able to cross
Right.
departments and work with.
Without,
Had you known Reggie?
No, I had
before?
never met him before.
And he had just finished his.
He had just finished his Ph.D. and he was from Michigan State and had done some histology.
Okay.
And he had identified a new skeletal muscle fiber type, which he called the intermediate fiber. Prior to our work, why muscle was red, slow twitch, or white, fast twitch.
That was it.
And that was it.
Yeah.
And Reggie had discovered this new fiber. So I was given the project to further characterize not only his fiber, but the slow twitch and the other fast twitch red and white muscles.
Wow.
And so in 1971, I published a paper in the American Journal of Physiology in which I titled it Histological, Biochemical, and Contractile Properties of the Different Skeletal Muscle Fiber Types.
Wow. This is probably the first
And this
anyone's ever
that's right.
done this.
This was the first.
Wow.
And then we went on to further categorize the biochemistry of the muscles, and we published a paper in '72 in Biochemistry in which we changed the name of the fiber types to slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, and the intermediate we called fast oxidative glycolytic, because we showed that that intermediate fiber was indeed a fast twitch fiber that had not only a high glycolytic capacity but also a high oxidative capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And that paper has been cited over 1,100 times.
Wow.
And is considered a citation classic.
Oh, now, did you co-author any of this with Reggie?
Yes, Reggie and I were on both papers.
I was going to say, because the timing, just think of the timing
Yeah.
of this, Jim, that you never knew each other, and you both show up
Yeah, it was
at
a
UCLA.
coincidence.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
well, Reggie had all of the histology work that was done in his lab, and in Jim Peters' lab, I did all of the biochemistry work, and then with some help from people in the physiology department, they gave me the equipment to measure the contractile properties.
Okay.
And so I set that up so we could measure all of the aspects of the fiber types.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went on to study the effects of exercise training on skeletal muscle. And we're some of the first to show that with endurance training, there's an increase in mitochondrial content in the muscle, and there's a shift in the fiber types. But the shift was from the glycolytic fast twitch to the fast twitch oxidative glycolytic, which goes along with the increase in mitochondrial content of the fibers.
Wow.
No change in the slow twitch to fast twitch fibers as some people had postulated might occur.
So this would be part of, I don't know what you would call it, the training effect?
Yeah. Right.
And no one had really documented that either.
No. John Halazzi was just getting started with his biochemistry studies at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So 3 years as a postdoc.
Yeah.
Then what?
I took a research position at UCLA in the medical school in cardiology and thoracic surgery, and I did a complete shift in my research emphasis to the field of cardiology.
Wow. Wow.
And I started out with chronic instrumented dogs running on the treadmill. And I was the first to demonstrate that at max exercise, there is still significant dilator reserve left in the coronary circulation, of about 40%, as a matter of fact.
Wow.
And when we did those studies, we really didn't appreciate the fact that the significance of it was that you could have about 40 to 50% of a coronary vessel blocked, but still deliver enough oxygen and nutrients to meet the demands of maximal exercise.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And that became significant many years later when it was realized that that 40 to 50% blocked artery is the one that actually ruptures and causes a large clot to form and actually causes most heart attacks that occur in this country.
Wow.
But we didn't appreciate it at the time we did the dilator reserve.
Yeah.
Then we went on to show that with exercise training in the dogs, why there was a reduction in coronary flow at rest and at submaximal workloads because the heart was doing less work but pumping out the same amount of blood. And in max exercise, the coronary flow was unchanged, but the heart was working harder. And the other important thing that we observed was that we maintained the coronary dilator reserve capacity in spite of the fact that the heart had become hypertrophied. So that meant that the coronary vessels were growing along with the muscle as it hypertrophied as a result of exercise training.
Which is a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
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 And during this same period of time, I started some studies with the Los Angeles City Fire Department. Someone had heard that I was involved with the fire department from the Heart Association.
Oh, yeah.
And they called me one day and said, would you like some money to do research on heart disease in firefighters? That's the only time in my entire career anybody's ever called me and wanted to give me money to do research. But what had happened is the firefighters had donated money through the AID United Way to the Heart Association, and they earmarked it to study heart disease in firefighters. Because it was suspected that firefighters had a very high incidence of heart disease.
Yeah. So this was in Los Angeles?
This was in Los Angeles. I work with both the city and the county fire departments. And I did a series of studies with the firefighters. And of course, at that time, they were only men. But we documented that they had some real serious heart disease problems. And one of the things that we observed was that sudden exercise without prior warm-up actually caused transient ischemia in the myocardium. And we had firefighters come to a laboratory at UCLA, and we cranked the treadmill up at a high grade and high speed and just had them jump on and run immediately, and then jump on a platform at the end. And we saw these changes in the electrocardiogram indicating ischemia. So we went back to our dog model and did the same type of thing and actually showed that at the onset of sudden exercise, there's a transient drop in the coronary flow at the time the oxygen demands of the heart are raising rapidly because of a tremendous increase in heart rate with the sudden exercise. And then we showed that with adequate warm-up, we just had the firefighters jog easily on the treadmill for 15 or 20 seconds, and then do the sudden exercise, that the EKG was normal in most every case.
Yeah, okay. What was the time period in you were doing that? Mid-70s?
That was in the mid-70s, yeah.
Okay. So, what was the next stop for you?
Well,
you've been at UCLA the whole time.
The whole time, yeah. In 1978, I was contacted by a medical group that wanted to know if I would be interested in working as a consultant to design an exercise rehabilitation program because of my association in cardiology and surgery at UCLA. And as it turned out, it was the Pritikin program.
Wow.
Which had been in Santa Barbara and was moving to Los Angeles. And the medical group that had contracted to provide the medical services for Mr. Pritikin and his diet and exercise program insisted on having a bona fide cardiac rehab program.
Good for them. Yeah.
And so I started to work with them. And one of the first things I noticed was that the claims that Nathan Pritikin had made about people could control their hypertension and their diabetes without medication and they could avoid bypass surgery probably was correct.
But it was based on diet, though,
it was based primarily on diet. When he had his program in Santa Barbara, he just told people, go out and walk in the morning and then go for another walk in the afternoon. If you have any energy left, go for another walk in the evening. But the medical group in Santa Monica said, no, we can't do that. These people are too sick. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of very sick cardiac patients in the program at that time.
So you found that basically their claims were correct.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of research on the Pritikin program. And as a matter of fact, at that point in time, I decided to switch my whole program to studying diet, exercise, and disease.
Wow.
And
You've had some major
changes.
Major changes.
Yeah. Well, I got more coming up. One of the first things I noticed in the Pritikin program was that the people with type 2 diabetes were responding very rapidly to the program. So rapidly that we had to have a refrigerator in the exercise facility with juice in it because some of them were experiencing hypoglycemia. And finally, I talked with the physicians, and we decided that as soon as people came into the Pritikin program, they would be taken off of their oral hypoglycemic agents because they were responding so quickly.
That's
so
amazing.
I started to collect some data to show that this was, in fact, an improvement in the diabetes situation.
Yeah.
And I found out that nobody knew anything about diabetes in those early 80s.
Wow.
And so I decided that I would switch my focus of research to go back to skeletal muscle and study glucose transport regulation. So one of my graduate students, Glenn Grimdich, developed the methods for isolating sarcolemma membranes from skeletal muscle so we could study the glucose transport system.
So Jim, how, I'm trying to, back to the structure at UCLA now, were you also teaching any classes, or were you just doing all research on grant money?
No, I was doing research on grant money, but I was at the same time doing some teaching in what then was the physical education department.
Okay.
And they kept offering me a faculty position, but their teaching loads were so high, I didn't want to get involved in the department. Finally, in 1978, I got married, and then I decided I would take a faculty position.
Okay.
And so that's when I actually switched to the Department of Physical Education, which had been renamed kinesiology in that period of time.
And that's where Reggie still was?
And that's where Reggie was. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So Reggie taught skeletal muscle stuff. I taught the cardiovascular stuff to the students.
Okay. That's probably about the time you met my old chairman at Washington, Bob Hutton.
Yes. Bob was at UCLA when I was there.
Okay.
And he moved to Washington.
Yeah, because he worked with Reggie, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. And all of a sudden, it's a smaller world.
Yeah. So we developed the isolated sarcolemma membrane preparation, which we used to study glucose transport. And a couple of my graduate students, Glenn Grimdich and Eric Sternlick, went on to show that, for example, with 45 minutes of exercise, you could increase the glucose transport in the skeletal muscle to the same level that you could with a maximum insulin injection.
Wow.
And so that really laid the basis for exercise as an important factor in the prevention and treatment of type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went on to show that when we put our animals on a high-fat refined sugar diet, they became insulin resistant. And the interesting thing that was happening at that period of time was Jerry Reven from Stanford, a physician with the diabetes people, introduced the concept of Syndrome X, the Metabolic Syndrome, which is an aggregation of coronary heart disease risk factors, including insulin resistance, hypertension, hypertriglyceridemia. And so we shifted back again from the glucose transport to go back and look at cardiovascular factors. And we showed that in participants in the Pritikin program that the diet and exercise could control the metabolic syndrome. And in our animal model, we could induce it by putting the animals on a high-fat refined sugar diet, like the typical U.S. diet.
Yeah.
So that explains why we have this thing called the metabolic syndrome that's so common in our society today.
Yeah, wow. Where were you guys publishing your stuff? Did you publish anything in MSSE?
Never.
Never?
Published a lot of stuff in the American Journal of Physiology, Journal of Applied Physiology,
Okay.
Circulation.
All the top journals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you haven't retired, or have you retired?
I officially retired from UCLA in '09,
Okay.
and then I immediately went on recall for 43% time.
Yeah.
I taught for 1 additional year, and at the present time I'm still on recall for research.
Okay.
I switched in the 90s, again, my research emphasis.
See, we haven't even talked about that. I jumped too far ahead.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah.
What happened
Well,
then?
I had a graduate student who informed me one day that he was going to finish his Ph.D. and then go to medical school. And he wanted to do something for his dissertation that might be related to medicine. And so I came up with the concept of studying the effects of diet and exercise on cancer.
Hmm.
And so we established a cell culture laboratory, and we went to the cancer people at UCLA and got cell lines for prostate cancer. Being an elderly man, was a little concerned about it.
Yeah.
And we showed that growing cancer cells in culture and then subjecting them to serum, we could change the growth rate, but more importantly, we could induce the cells to go in apoptosis by using serum from people who had gone through the Pritikin program.
Oh, my heavens.
And so we did a series of studies with prostate cancer, and then we also did a series of studies with breast cancer cell lines.
So you were finding that a change in lifestyle basically could slow it down.
Yeah, well, the pharmaceutical industry has been trying for many years to develop drugs that would block the development of blood vessels into tumors.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew that blood supply was an important factor in tumor development and growth. So my assumption was that if you change factors in serum, you might slow the growth and, as I said, actually induce the tumors to go into apoptosis. And what we found was reduction in insulin, reduction in IGF-1 were the two most important factors that altered the growth and the apoptosis of the tumor cells.
And this was his dissertation then?
That was, yeah, it was part of his dissertation, and I had 2 other students who did their dissertation on the same type of work.
Wow. Okay.
So the cancer field was what I pretty much ended with the exception of the fact that once we had the cell culture laboratory set up, I had another graduate student, Chris Roberts, and Chris decided that he didn't want to do the glucose transport stuff that we had done before. He wanted to do something different. And so he was actually involved in the metabolic syndrome studies. And he came to me one day and he said, I want to study nitric oxide. And I didn't know much about nitric oxide, except we had a faculty member at UCLA who was up for the Nobel Prize for the discovery of nitric oxide,
Wow.
Lou Ignero. And we talked with him, and Chris then eventually showed that in the animal model you could induce hypertension by the high-fat refined sugar diet, and it seemed to be associated with a stealing or blunting of the nitric oxide effect in the muscle of the artery wall, which was actually causing artery malfunction, and that was leading to hypertension.
Wow.
And then we looked at other aspects of the Pritikin program related to atherosclerosis. We set up a cell culture of artery walls. We laid down smooth muscle cells, and then we coated endothelial cells over the top of it, and showed that many of the factors that are thought to be related to the development of atherosclerosis were in fact dramatically suppressed when people went through the Pritikin program and had these dramatic changes in their serum.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So Pritikin has a lot to owe to you.
Well, it goes both ways.
Yeah, yeah.
At the present time, I've published about 60 papers from data we've collected from people going through the Pritikin program.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the most exciting research we're doing at the present time, and that is with children that go through the Pritikin program. In the summer, they have a family program where people can bring their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we've studied obese kids that have gone through the Pritikin program. And we have a paper that's under review at the present time in AJP showing that inflammatory cytokines are dramatically lowered in just 2 weeks of diet and exercise in these overweight kids. But of course, in 2 weeks, they still have the same fat cells that are there, but there's less of a response as far as producing these inflammatory factors are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll probably have a few more papers to do in that area before I completely retire.
Or change fields yet another time.
I don't think so. I've actually closed my laboratory. I've run out of funding, so.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, what a run, huh?
Yeah, it's been a long one.
Yeah. So Reggie's still there,
Yeah.
I guess, right? Here.
Reggie's about to retire.
Yeah, I'll be talking with him this afternoon.
Yeah.
So you and Baldwin and Booth and you guys have kept in touch and friends and stuff ever since Iowa.
Absolutely. Yeah. What
which is
happened
neat.
when I graduated and came to UCLA, Irvine was just starting the medical school. And I actually taught the cardiovascular physiology the first year they had medical students.
Oh.
And they offered me a faculty position, but I wanted to stay at UCLA. So I recommended Baldwin.
I'll be doing.
And that's how Baldwin got hired at Irvine. And of course,
And he's still
been
there.
He's been there ever since. He's about to retire at the end of this year, too.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And he did a postdoc with Halazzi.
With John Halazzi.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Because when you went out there, he went to St. Louis.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a great group.
Yeah, it's been unbelievable.
No wonder Tipton is so proud, you
Yeah.
know, of everybody. I mean, what a unique timing for everything.
Well, I tell people all the time that one of the main reasons that I've been so successful over the years in my research program is the program that Tipton had laid out for us, but more importantly probably was the interaction of all the students that were in the Pritikin program.
Yeah.
Because Tipton emphasized the fact that you challenge each other.
Mm-hmm.
If you challenge each other to be the best, why?
You don't mean the Pritikin program, you
No,
mean Iowa.
the Tipton program.
The Tipton, yeah, that's what I thought.
Where we were all students
At the same time. Yeah, that's right. Was there another group that sort of came after you guys then that made such a contribution?
Not really, because after a few years, then Tipton moved to Arizona.
Right.
And
okay.
he
That's true.
tried to reestablish the same type of program at Arizona, but just the physical education people at Arizona didn't go along with the program, I guess.
Yeah. Was Gisolfi a student at Iowa then?
No, Gisolfi was a student with Sid Robinson.
Okay, and then he came to Iowa
And then he
as
came
faculty.
to Iowa as a faculty member
Okay.
when he graduated from Indiana.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Jim.
Oh,
I
you're
told
quite
you,
welcome.
30 minutes is gone.
You're right.
Fast. This has been just fantastic.
Good.
Thank you so much.
You're very
I
welcome.
appreciate it, Jim.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.